My name's Dr. Paul Richardson, and I'm the Director of Clinical Research and the Clinical Program Leader for the Jerome Lipper Multiple Myeloma Center at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. I think there was a lot of good news for myeloma patients at ASCO. I think probably obviously that the big news were the two large trials in monoclonal antibody therapy that were reported. ELOQUENT-2, which we participated in, was a large phase 3 trial comparing lenalidomide and dexamethasone to lenalidomide, dexamethasone and elotuzumab in patients with relapsed refractory myeloma. And this was a large international phase 3 study which met its primary endpoint comfortably, showing a progression-free survival benefit for patients receiving the 3 drugs over the 2. And what was particularly interesting and exciting was that whilst the median was around 4.5 months, which is certainly impressive, if you looked at subgroups, in particular looked at patients with high-risk cytogenetics, the clinical benefit was particularly pronounced. When you also looked at responders and you looked at patients who achieved complete remission in either arm, you saw that the patients who achieved complete remission and were on the 3 drugs, their progression-free survival was particularly encouraging. So I think what we had from the ELOQUENT-2 trial was the evidence that, for the first time, an antibody combined to the backbone of lenalidomide-based therapy was particularly effective. What I particularly like in ELOQUENT-2 is we also showed that the combination was well tolerated, and there really were no significant increase in side effects over and above the control arm, and the rate of infusional toxicity was very low and very manageable. So I think, again, the positive results from ELOQUENT-2 were primary endpoint of progression-free survival benefit met, high-risk patients particularly benefiting. Also, the response rate was in favor of the 3 drugs over the 2, and also finally that if you were under the age of 65 or over the age of 65, the same degrees of benefit were seen. So this was not something that was specific to younger patients and not to older patients. So very exciting data from ELOQUENT-2. Then from a drug monoclonal antibody that's very near and dear to me, daratumumab, which we've been very much part of the phase 1 and early phase development of. That drug has now been combined and taken into phase 2 study, where it's used basically daratumumab as a single agent, but with obviously steroid pre-medication. And Dr. Sagaloniel presented the results of a phase 2 trial in the United States, multi-center, large number of patients. And these patients had all received prior IMiD and bortezomib-based therapy, so they were classic relapsed refractory patients. And what was particularly important, I think, in this study was that a significant number of them had also received prior pomalidomide and prior carfilzomib. So in a sense, they had been exposed to the best classes of drugs that we currently have. And the very good news for patients participating in this trial, even though these other agents had unfortunately either run out of benefit or had actually failed these patients, when they came to daratumumab, at least a third approximately received clinical benefit, and the actual response rate was approximately just shy of 30%, and very encouragingly a number of complete responses were also seen. What I think is particularly encouraging from this large phase 2 trial is that these were patients in whom all the previous therapies that had been used had run out of benefit. So for relapsed refractory patients, single agent daratumumab with a little bit of steroid for pre-medication showed a response rate that was compelling and a completely new mechanism of action targeting CD38. The other thing was the side effect profile was favorable and certainly manageable. And speaking more broadly to daratumumab, we're combining it with lenalidomide and showing remarkable results. It's also being combined with bortezomib, it's also being combined with pomalidomide, and all of these strategies are bearing fruit for patients and showing real substantial responses, even in the most resistant disease. So I'm very optimistic that both elotuzumab and daratumumab will achieve FDA approval fairly soon. I think elotuzumab will probably achieve full approval based upon the randomized phase 3 trial, and my hope is that daratumumab will get accelerated approval relatively soon as well, which is great for patients. So I think that was the real highlights for me of ASCO. I think going beyond that, there was also all sorts of other exciting data. First and foremost, there were studies that showed that clearly carfilzomib is an outstanding proteasome inhibitor when it's given in patients with relapsed disease who've had prior bortezomib as part of their initial therapy. This was the so-called ENDEAVOR study. The ENDEAVOR trial showed that if you compared retreatment with bortezomib versus treatment with carfilzomib, carfilzomib performed very well. And I think that's encouraging. It showed that, in fact, even just as a drug with some steroid, as opposed to with Revlimid, which was, of course, the results of the ASPIRE trial, if you use just carfilzomib with steroid, it actually did better than bortezomib and dexamethasone as part of this essential retreatment study. But I would say that I personally think carfilzomib is best suited in combination with Revlimid based upon the very exciting results of the ASPIRE trial. So I think very good news for carfilzomib, so a great ASCO for carfilzomib. I think the other drugs that seem to show great promise was that when you combine panobinostat with other drugs, not bortezomib as it's approved for, but actually for drugs like lenalidomide and also carfilzomib, the results were really quite compelling. So again, great news in that regard as well. So all around for patients, I think ASCO was positive. We showed that the antibodies have really arrived. More encouraging data for carfilzomib, encouraging data for panobinostat, and I think as something of a sidebar, some important news from lenalidomide maintenance post-transplant from our own group, the Alliance, in which my colleague Dr. Sarah Holstein, with the leadership of Dr. Phil McCarthy, showed with long-term follow-up from our maintenance study, which looked at maintenance of lenalidomide post-transplant until progression, we showed continued clinical benefit with an improvement in overall survival benefit, which is very important. And at the same time, we also showed that while second primaries were a risk in the study, the risk was relatively, in fact, very small. And in fact, whilst it was bigger if you received Revlimid versus if you didn't, the relative risks were actually very, very, I think, acceptable in terms of this order of magnitude. And what was very important to share with our patients is that it was hugely offset by the benefit of reducing the risk of recurrent myeloma and the impact on survival that would have. So I think patients can be reassured that lenalidomide maintenance shows continued clinical benefit, and particularly if it's continued until progression. Also, that the second primary risk, whilst we have to be alert to it, and we have to figure out how we can reduce it, seems to be driven mainly by genotoxic chemotherapy like melphalan. But having said that, that risk is very small.